So I want you to imagine just for a second that you're an Indian jeweler. You're based in Mumbai, and you're executing this massive transaction. Let's say you're buying $100 million worth of raw gold from a huge wholesale distributor over in Dubai.
Okay, that's a serious order.
Right, it's massive.
Mm-hmm.
And for the last, I don't know, 70 years, the mechanics of that specific transaction were basically set in stone. The invoice arrives, and it's denominated in US dollars.
Always.
Always. So the jeweler in Mumbai has to take their Indian rupees down to their local bank. They have to pay a spread to convert those rupees into dollars, right? And then they wire that money through the SWIFT network.
Where a correspondent bank in New York probably gets their hands on it.
Exactly. A bank in New York processes it, skims a fee, and then finally routes it to the UAE. And then the wholesaler over there might even have to convert it again into dirhams, paying yet another fee.
Right, it's just friction on top of friction.
Totally. Both parties are losing margin. But crucially, both parties are now completely exposed to the daily volatility of the US dollar, which is, a currency neither of them actually prints or uses to buy their groceries.
It's an artificial middleman.
Right. But what if I told you that as of today, that entire process is being systematically dismantled? Like, what if that jeweler could just pay in rupees instantly and bypass the US dollar entirely?
I mean, if you suggested that even a few years ago at a macroeconomics seminar, you'd have been laughed out of the room.
Literally laughed at. But today, it's not a joke. It is the explicit master plan of the Reserve Bank of India.
It really is. And I'd argue it's, without exaggeration, a fundamental rewiring of the global trade architecture. What we're witnessing here is the dismantling of a legacy system that, well, it placed this immense artificial friction on emerging markets for decades.
Yeah.
And the mechanics of how the RBI is actually pulling this off, like the underlying plumbing they are replacing, it is arguably the most fascinating story in global finance right now.
Which is exactly what we are here to unpack today.
Yeah.
So welcome to this deep dive. If you're listening to this, you're likely staring down the barrel of a major professional examination. And sitting right at the center of your syllabus is this massive, highly technical document.
Oh yeah, Chapter 5.
Right, Chapter 5 of the Reserve Bank of India's Annual Report 2025-26. It covers financial markets and foreign exchange management. And look, we're not just going to skim this for you.
Going into the weeds.
Exactly. We're going to treat this exactly how two senior analysts would brief up here. We're going to decode the mechanics, the history, and the real underlying logic of what the RBI is building here. So by the time we're done, you're not just going to memorize the numbers to pass your exam. You'll actually understand the geopolitical chess match playing out in real time.
Because to truly grasp this 2025-26 report, you have to first understand the philosophical shift happening within the central bank itself.
The mindset change.
Exactly. Historically, central banks in emerging markets, they operated like fortresses. They were obsessed with capital controls, terrified of, hot money.
The foreign capital that floods in during a boom and then just suddenly vanishes the first sign of trouble.
Right, which completely destabilizes the domestic economy. So the old regulatory framework was basically designed to just say no. It was rigid, rule-heavy, heavily categorized.
Very defensive.
Very defensive. But a fortress, while it keeps you safe, is entirely static. If India wants to be a global economic tower house, a static fortress is a severe liability.
Right, because, you can't invite global capital to the party and then keep all the doors double locked.
Precisely. So what you are seeing all throughout this report is this transition from a rigid fortress to a really dynamic, highly calibrated control room. They're moving away from restrictive, rule-based oversight toward principle-based dynamic regulation.
They're starting to actually trust the depth of their own markets.
Yeah. Yes. And to execute this, the RBI is relying on 3 core pillars. These represent the 3 main departments handling the transition. So first, you have the architects who lay down the tracks and set the rules.
FMRD.
Right. Second, you have the engineers, the mechanics who actually operate the machinery day to day and manage the flow of liquidity.
That's FMOD.
Yep. And third, you have the diplomats who are building the bridges connecting India's domestic machinery to the rest of the world.
The FMD. Okay, let's start with those architects. The Financial Markets Regulation Department, or the FMRD. So their entire mandate is about modernizing the infrastructure of the money markets, government securities, derivatives, all of that. They write the code that the rest of the financial system runs on.
The rule makers.
Right. And their biggest target this past year has been recalibrating the rules for foreign money coming into India. specifically looking at debt markets and foreign portfolio investors, FPIs.
Right. And to really understand what they changed, you have to understand what was broken in the first place. Let's look at the concept of concentration limits.
Okay, lay it out.
For years, the RBI had incredibly strict rules about how much of a specific corporate bond a foreign entity could buy. They also had strict limits on how much short-term debt an FPI could hold in their overall portfolio.
But wait, what was the historical justification for those limits? I mean, why actively restrict someone who genuinely wants to lend money to your domestic corporations?
It goes right back to that fear of hot money, specifically the scars from the 1997 Asian financial crisis and the 2013 taper tantrum.
Oh, the taper tantrum was brutal.
It was. So imagine you let a single massive foreign hedge fund buy up, say, 80% of the debt of a crucial Indian infrastructure company.
Okay.
And then some crisis hits in New York, the fund panics, they liquidate everything. They could literally collapse that Indian company's ability to finance itself overnight. So those concentration limits were guardrails. The RBI was essentially saying, you can invest here, but you have to spread your money around. We will not let any single foreign entity hold too much concentrated power over our domestic debt.
Makes sense. But the FMRD has completely reversed their stance here, haven't they? I mean, the report states they withdrew the short-term and concentration limits for FPIs investing in corporate debt under the general route.
It completely cleared them out.
And they also fundamentally altered the voluntary retention rate, the VRR. And if you're taking the exam, there's a specific date attached to this transition you need to know. April 1st, 2026.
Mark that date down.
Definitely. But wait, let me play devil's advocate here. If we remove those concentration limits, aren't we just inviting exactly the kind of volatility the RBI spent decades trying to prevent? Like, what happens now if that massive European pension fund dumps billions of dollars of corporate bonds in a single afternoon?
It's the most logical pushback to this policy, but the RBI's calculation here is based on the newfound maturity of India's domestic markets. So, 10 or 15 years ago, yes, a massive foreign exit would have absolutely cratered the market. But today, the domestic institutional investors entities like the massive Indian mutual fund industry, the Life Insurance Corporation of India, the EPFO, these domestic pools of capital have grown exponentially.
Ah, I see.
They act as a massive shock absorber now. If a foreign pension fund suddenly sells $1 billion of corporate bonds, there's now enough domestic liquidity waiting in the wings to step in and buy those bonds without causing yields to violently spike.
So the pool's finally deep enough that one big splash won't empty it.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And because the pool is deep, the RBI can finally afford to prioritize the ease of doing business. Think about it from the perspective of that foreign pension fund manager.
Right. They're managing billions of euros.
Yeah, and they don't want to navigate a labyrinth of arbitrary percentage caps and sector limits just to invest in, like an Indian solar farm. By lifting these restrictions under the general route, the RBI is drastically lowering the administrative friction of bringing capital into the country.
And that ties directly into what they're doing with the voluntary retention route, the VRR. Previously, VRR was this separate track where FPIs got exemptions from certain rules, but in exchange, they had to commit to keeping their money locked in India for a minimum retention period.
It was a strict trade-off.
Right. But the FMRD is streamlining this too. So effective April 1st, 2026, investments under VRR will be reckoned under the general route limit. And crucially, if an FPI has passed their minimum retention period, they can liquidate and exit fully or partly without any penalty.
It's a massive simplification of the accounting. The RBI is just clearing out the underbrush of legacy regulations. They want clean, transparent, massive pipelines for foreign capital, not a dozen tiny conditional straws.
I love that pipeline analogy.
Yeah.
And it isn't just corporate bonds they're fixing. The architects at FMRD are also looking at how foreign entities utilize their idle cash. Which brings us to a highly specific mechanism in the report, Special Rupee Vostro Accounts, or SRVAs.
Oh, SRVAs are critical.
We are going to dive incredibly deep into the geopolitical implications of SRVAs later when we talk about the FedE. But strictly from a regulatory standpoint, the FMRD made a very quiet, very powerful change here.
Yeah, they did.
Surplus balances sitting in these SRVAs can now be invested in central government securities, including short-term treasury bills, as well as non-convertible debentures and commercial papers.
To appreciate how big this is, you have to understand the sheer inefficiency of the old system. So let's say a bank in Russia or the UAE holds a Vostro account with a bank in Mumbai.
Right, and just for the listener, vostro literally translates from Latin as yours. So from the Indian bank's perspective, it's your account with us.
Exactly. Now, let's say that Russian bank has a surplus of 1 billion rupees sitting in that account because of some imbalance in trade. Historically, that was just dead capital.
Just sitting there.
Just cash sitting in a vault, earning nothing, doing nothing for the broader economy.
Which makes holding rupees highly unattractive for a foreign entity in the first place.
Precisely. If you are a foreign bank, you despise idle cash. You want yield. By the FMRD allowing these foreign-owned rupee surpluses to be deployed into Indian treasury bills or short-term corporate commercial paper, two massive things happen.
Okay, what's the first?
First, the foreign bank actually earns a yield, which makes them much more willing to accept and hold Indian rupees to begin with. And second, you are utilizing that foreign capital to deepen the liquidity of the Indian government's own short-term debt markets. It's an incredibly elegant feedback loop.
It's turning dead weight into structural support. That's brilliant. And speaking of structural support, while they're deepening the federal debt market, they're also doing something really clever at the local level. The report notes that municipal bonds are now eligible collateral for repo transactions.
This is a phenomenal mechanical tweak.
Let's break the mechanics of that down for the listener, because repo markets can be confusing. Let's say the puny municipal corporation issues a 10-year bond to finance a massive new public transit system, and a domestic bank buys that municipal bond.
Yeah.
In the past, if that bank suddenly needed short-term cash to meet its daily liquidity requirements, that municipal bond they just bought wasn't very helpful to them.
Right, because in the repo market, the repurchase agreement market, which is how banks lend each other cash overnight, the collateral demanded, is usually pristine, sovereign-backed central government securities.
The G-SECs.
Yeah. You hand over a GSEC, you get overnight cash, and you buy the GSEC back the next day with a tiny bit of interest. Municipal bonds just weren't considered liquid or safe enough to serve as that collateral.
But the FMRD changed that. By making municipal bonds eligible for repo, they instantly conferred this massive liquidity premium onto city-level debt.
Exactly.
Now, that bank knows that if they buy the puny transit bond, they can easily pledge it in the repo market if they get into a cash crunch. And because the bond is now more useful to the bank is willing to accept a slightly lower interest rate from the city of Pune.
Which fundamentally lowers the cost of borrowing for infrastructure at the municipal level across all of India. It's a prime example of how this tiny regulatory tweak in the plumbing of the financial system can result in billions of rupees saved in public infrastructure costs.
Amazing. Okay, so FMRD is fixing the rules for debt and collateral. But they're also fundamentally upgrading the actual technology of the markets. Let's look at their push into electronification and tokenization.
The tech frontier.
Right. They extended the horizon for Forex forward contracts, allowing them to trade and settle for tenors up to 36 months, up from the previous cap of 13 months, which gives corporations a much longer runway to hedge currency risk.
Yeah.
But the absolute showstopper in this section is the UMI platform, the Unified Markets Interface.
If there is one technological initiative from this entire annual report that represents the future of central banking globally, it is the UMI.
Yeah, the FMRD initiated a pilot for issuing and trading certificates of deposit CDs in a tokenized form on the UMI platform. And here's the kicker for your exam. They are settled using wholesale central bank digital currency, wholesale CBDC.
We really need to dissect this carefully because when people hear the word tokenization, they immediately think of unregulated crypto casinos.
Right, they think Bitcoin or Dogecoin.
And we have to violently separate those two concepts. This is not Bitcoin. This is institutional, state-backed, highly regulated, distributed ledger technology, DLT.
So let's walk through the exact mechanics of what a certificate of deposit is and how tokenizing it changes everything.
Okay. A CD is simply a short-term debt instrument. A bank needs cash, so they issue a CD, promising to pay the holder back with interest in, say, 90 days. In the traditional financial system, that CD is essentially a digital entry on a centralized ledger maintained by a clearing corporation.
And when Bank A wants to sell that CD to Bank B, the clearing corporation has to update their centralized ledger. Bank A has to transfer the CD, and Bank B has to transfer the cash, usually through the real-time gross settlement system, the RTGS.
Exactly. And even though we call it real time, in the back end plumbing of institutional finance, the movement of the asset and the movement of the money are two separate, distinct messaging processes.
So they don't happen at the exact same physical moment.
No, they don't. Because they're separate, there's this microscopic but very real window of settlement risk. What if Bank A delivers the CD, but Bank B's cash transfer fails or gets delayed?
Oh, man.
In a system processing trillions of rupees, settlement risk is a systemic nightmare.
Okay, so how does tokenization on the UMI platform actually eliminate that risk?
When you tokenize the CD, you create a programmable digital twin of that asset on a distributed ledger. It operates as a smart contract. Now, crucially, the payment leg of the transaction isn't happening through the old RTGS system anymore. The payment is made using wholesale CBDC.
Which is literally the digital rupee issued directly by the RBI.
Yes. And natively existing on that exact same distributed ledger.
So both the asset and the cash are living in the exact same technological environment.
Yes. And because they are on the same DLT platform, the transaction can be programmed to be atomic.
Atomic settlement.
Right. Atomic settlement means the transfer of the tokenized CD and the transfer of the wholesale CBDC happen at the exact same millisecond. Or they don't happen at all. Delivery versus payment is simultaneous and mathematically guaranteed by the cryptographic consensus of the ledger. There is absolutely zero settlement risk.
Wow. It's the digital equivalent of two people handing each other a physical bearer bond and a briefcase of physical cash at the exact same moment.
But it's happening between massive financial institutions at the speed of light.
That's incredible.
It fundamentally changes capital efficiency. If a bank doesn't have to worry about settlement risk, they don't have to hold as much capital in reserve to cover potential clearing failures. They can deploy that capital more efficiently.
And if we zoom out a bit, this tokenization pilot isn't happening in isolation, is it? The report explicitly ties this to the RBI's Utkarsh 2.0 framework.
Yes, Utkarsh 2.0, that's the RBI's medium-term strategy document.
A core pillar of Utkarsh 2.0 is adopting and driving global standards. For example, the report highlights the implementation of the Unique Transaction Identifier, the UTI, for over-the-counter derivatives.
The UTI is huge. It's a globally recognized standard that ensures every single bespoke derivative trade has a unique digital fingerprint. Regulators across the world can track it, which prevents the kind of opaque systemic risk buildup that caused the 2008 financial crisis.
Right. And they're also integrating their domestic platforms globally. The FMRD connected the NDSFM, the Negotiated Dealing System Order Matching Platform, which is basically the electronic lifeblood where Indian government bonds are traded directly to global bond trading platforms.
The friction is just being erased everywhere. A trader sitting at a desk in London, staring at a Bloomberg terminal, can now seamlessly route a massive order directly into the Indian sovereign bond market without having to jump through a dozen localized intermediary hoops.
But, I mean, if you are building the infrastructure for seamless, massive global volume, you run into a very basic human problem: time zones.
Right, which brings us to the operational rules.
You can't invite the world to trade your sovereign debt and then close your markets at 3:3 p.m. Indian Standard Time. So the FMRD extended the trading timings for money markets. And behind every major operational shift at the RBI, there is usually a very specific committee that did the math.
And you need to know their names for the exam.
Yes. In this case, the extension of trading hours for collateralized and uncollateralized money markets was recommended by the Sri Radha Shyamratha Working Group.
The Sri Radha Shyamratha Working Group. It is essential to recognize the names behind these structural shifts. They are the architects of the new market hours, recognizing that liquidity simply doesn't sleep.
Right. And as the market hours extend and the volume just explodes, the RBI physically cannot police every single granular interaction. So they are delegating. The FMRD formally granted SRO status, self-regulatory organization status, to FinMkt. That's the Fixed Income Money Market and Derivatives Association of India.
This is a classic hallmark of a maturing financial ecosystem. Think of the RBI as the Supreme Court and the legislature combined.
Okay.
They set the broad systemic laws, like you cannot commit fraud, you must maintain capital buffers.
Yeah.
But the day-to-day granular market practices, like exactly how a specific derivative contract should be priced in a dispute, or what the standard ethical conduct on a trading desk should be, That is delegated to the SRO.
Because FinMkt is made up of the market participants themselves.
Exactly. They understand the microscopic nuances way better than a central regulator ever could. By granting them SRO status, the RBI is creating a flexible, peer-regulated layer that can adapt to new financial products much faster than the central bank can draft new master directions.
But the RBI still controls the ultimate source of truth in the market, the interest rate benchmarks. And this brings us to one of the most mechanically profound changes in the FMRD section, the transition to the TSRR, the secured overnight rupee rate. Let me see if I can formulate an analogy to explain why benchmarks matter so much.
Let's hear it.
Okay, think of a financial benchmark like the gyroscope or the altimeter in an airplane. Every single commercial loan, every floating rate mortgage, every complex derivative contract uses a benchmark rate to figure out exactly where the ground is, to calculate who owes what to whom. If your altimeter is broken, the entire financial system is flying blind.
That is an excellent way to frame it.
For years, the Indian system was using an old altimeter benchmarks like MIBOR that were heavily influenced by the unsecured call money market. But the entire topology of the financial landscape shifted out from under them.
It really did. The unsecured call money market is exactly what it sounds like. Bank A lending Bank B cash overnight with absolutely zero collateral, based purely on trust and creditworthiness. Prior to the global financial crisis, this was how banks operated. But crises change behavior. Banks became fundamentally risk-averse. They realized that trusting a peer institution without collateral was a recipe for disaster. So the actual volume of trading in the unsecured call money market dried up to a trickle.
The banks essentially abandoned that specific airspace.
Exactly. The massive real money moved to the secured collateralized markets, specifically the basket repo market and the tri-party repo market, widely known as TREP.
Tri-party repo.
Yeah. In a TREP transaction, a neutral third party, a clearing corporation, holds the collateral and manages the exchange, making the overnight loan practically risk-free. Because it's so safe, this is where 99% of the daily liquidity management between Indian financial institutions actually happens today.
But the old benchmark altimeter was still pointing to that empty, unsecured airspace.
Right. It was a structural vulnerability. If trillions of rupees in derivative contracts are priced based on a market where almost no actual trading is happening, that benchmark becomes highly susceptible to manipulation by a few rogue actors, and it just fails to reflect the true cost of capital in the economy.
So the FMRD authorized Financial Benchmarks India Private Limited, FBIL, to build a new altimeter, the SORO, the secured overnight rupee rate.
And the SORA is robust because it's calculated based on the actual massive daily transaction volumes occurring in those collateralized basket repo and TR8 markets.
It's not just a guess.
No, it isn't based on estimates or the expert judgment of a few bankers. It's purely data-driven by actual secured trades. It is an unshakable representation of the true overnight cost of money. And for your notes, FBIL officially commenced the publication of the SORA benchmark on July 7, 2025.
July 7, 2025. Got it. So we have new SROs, extended hours, new secure benchmarks, and tokenized assets. FMRD is clearly accelerating the vehicle, but they are also installing a very specific set of brakes regarding currency speculation.
Ah, the NOP-INR caps.
Exactly. Effective April 10th, 2026. Authorized dealers, the major banks, must maintain their net open position involving the rupee, their NOPIR, within a strict cap of US $100 million at the end of each business day.
The net open position is a critical concept to grasp. Look, a bank's business is facilitating trade. An exporter brings them dollars to buy rupees, an importer brings them rupees to buy dollars. Throughout the trading day, the bank is constantly accumulating and offloading foreign currency.
Right.
But if, at the end of the day, the bank has bought $1 billion more than it has sold, it has a massive long position on the dollar and a short position on the rupee.
Meaning if the rupee suddenly strengthens overnight, the bank loses a fortune.
Precisely. If a bank is holding a massive open position, they are no longer just facilitating client trade. They are actively placing a highly leveraged speculative bet on the macroeconomic direction of the sovereign currency.
They're acting like a hedge fund.
And central banks abhor it when utility-like commercial banks act like speculative hedge funds with their own currency. By instituting this hard US $100 million cap at the close of business, the FMRD is forcing the banks to square off their books.
You can make markets during the day, you can provide liquidity to your clients, but before you go home, you must neutralize your exposure.
Exactly. It's a vital guardrail to prevent systemic banking crises triggered by sudden currency shocks.
Okay, let's take a breath. That covers the architects. The FMRD has completely remodeled the fortress. They've dropped concentration limits to deepen the corporate bond pool, they've built atomic settlement on DLT, they've calibrated a new secure altimeter with SRR, and they've bolted down the speculative risks with NOPINR caps. The tracks are laid. Now we move to the engineers who actually have to drive the train.
We enter the control room of the Financial Markets Operations Department, the FMOD.
Right. If FMRD writes the sheet music, FMOD is the orchestra playing the instrument in real time. Their primary mandate is implementing the monetary policy objectives determined by the Monetary Policy Committee.
And the way you implement monetary policy, the way you ensure the interest rate in the real economy matches the target rate set by the RBI governor, is by violently, actively managing the daily supply of liquidity in the banking system.
Violently is an apt word for 2025-26. It was a year of massive hydraulic shifts.
It really was.
The report explicitly outlines a major operational pivot here. Based on the recommendations of an internal working group, a revised liquidity management framework was officially implemented on September 30, 2025. Let me push you on this. Why a revised framework? What was failing in the old system that required a total overhaul in September?
To understand the revision, we have to understand the three massive, chaotic forces that FMOD was constantly battling to keep the banking system stable. The report identifies them as erratic changes in government cash balances, expansions in currency in circulation, or CIC, and highly volatile global capital flows. Let's use a mechanical analogy here.
Okay, lay it on me.
Imagine the entire Indian commercial banking system, every deposit from every citizen and corporation as the ballast tanks of a massive submarine. To keep the submarine perfectly level at the target depth, which represents the target interest rate, the amount of water or liquidity in those tanks must remain perfectly stable. But the submarine is constantly being subjected to external forces trying to flood the tanks or drain them dry.
Let's apply those three forces to the submarine. Force number one, government cash balances.
Think about corporate advance tax payment deadlines. On a specific week in a quarter, thousands of massive corporations simultaneously transfer trillions of rupees out of their commercial bank accounts and deposit them into the Government of India's central account, which sits at the RBI.
So literally overnight, a massive volume of water is violently pumped out of the commercial banking submarine's ballast tanks.
Yes. The system experiences a severe liquidity deficit. If FMOD does nothing, banks will panic, they won't have enough cash to meet their daily reserve requirements, and the overnight interest rate will skyrocket far above the RBI's target.
Which chokes the economy.
Exactly. Conversely, when the government suddenly executes massive spending programs, paying out millions of salaries or clearing massive infrastructure contracts, trillions of rupees flood back into the commercial banks, overfilling the ballast tanks and threatening to crash interest rates down to zero.
Okay, force number two, currency in circulation, CIC.
This is driven by human behavior. Consider the weeks leading up to Diwali. Hundreds of millions of citizens go to ATMs and withdraw physical cash to buy gifts and pay bonuses. That physical cash literally leaves the digital commercial banking system. It's another massive drain on the ballast tanks.
And force number three, volatile capital flows, which connects directly back to the foreign capital we discussed in the FMRD section.
Right. If a global index suddenly includes Indian bonds or a wave of foreign direct investment hits, foreign entities are bringing billions of US dollars, selling them to the RBI or domestic banks in exchange for rupees to buy those bonds. The banking system is suddenly flooded with fresh rupee liquidity.
So FMOD is sitting in the control room, watching these massive drains and floods occurring simultaneously. How do they actually fix it?
Right.
What are the physical levers they pull under this revised framework?
They utilize the Liquidity Adjustment Facility, the LAF. The primary dynamic tools are variable rate repo, VRR, and variable rate reverse repo, VRR, auctions.
Walk me through the mechanics of a VRR auction. How does FMOD inject water into the tank?
So if FMOD forecasts that tax season is about to drain the system, they announce a variable rate repo auction. They tell the commercial banks, we have 1 trillion rupees of fresh cash available. Bring us your pristine government bonds as collateral and bid on the interest rate you are willing to pay us for a 14-day loan.
Okay, and then?
The banks hand over their bonds to the RBI, and the RBI electronically credits their accounts with 1 trillion rupees. Water is injected, the submarine stabilizes.
And the exact inverse for a VRR. If foreign capital floods the system, FAOD runs a variable rate reverse repo. They say to the banks, you have too much idle cash, give it to us, and we will give you our government bonds as collateral, and we will pay you a slight interest rate. The RBI sucks the excess water out of the tanks, locking it away safely so it doesn't depress the overnight rates.
Precisely. And under the revised September 2025 framework, they really refined how they operate the floor and the ceiling of this entire corridor.
Right, the SDF and MSF.
Yes. The floor is the standing deposit facility, the SDF, where banks can park excess cash overnight without the RBI having to provide collateral. The ceiling is the marginal standing facility, the MSF, where desperate banks can borrow overnight at a premium rate. FMOD's ultimate goal with all this VRR and VRR dancing is to ensure that the actual overnight borrowing rate between banks stays laser aligned with the target policy repo rate.
That's the weighted average call rate, or WACR.
Exactly.
It's an incredible, highly technical balancing act. But managing domestic liquidity is really only half of FMOD's job. The other half is arguably far more intense and definitely far more scrutinized by the global financial press. They are the frontline soldiers battling USD-INR volatility.
Yes. Managing the exchange rate.
The annual report does not mince words here. The Indian rupee faced severe, sustained downward pressure in the 2025-26 fiscal year. The explicit culprits cited by the RBI are escalating geopolitical tensions, profound uncertainties regarding global trade tariffs, a widening merchandise trade deficit, and a sharp rise in global oil prices in the final quarter.
All hitting at once.
Let's trace the mechanical loop of that last one. How exactly does an oil spike in the Middle East attack the value of the rupee in Mumbai?
It is a brutal arithmetic. India is heavily dependent on imported energy. We import the vast majority of our crude oil, and global crude oil is priced and settled overwhelmingly in US dollars. So if the price of a barrel of oil jumps from $70 to $90, Indian oil marketing corporations suddenly need vastly more US dollars to buy the exact same physical amount of oil just to keep the country running.
So they go to the forex markets with massive piles of Indian rupees, desperately trying to sell them to buy US dollars.
Exactly. It's basic supply and demand. They are dumping massive supply of rupees onto the market and generating a massive demand for dollars. This fundamental economic gravity pulls the value of the rupee down. It depreciates.
Now, how does FMOD respond to this? The report states they actively intervened in the onshore and offshore over-the-counter markets, as well as the exchange-traded currency derivative segments. But I want to clarify something critical here for the exam. What is their actual objective when they intervene? Are they trying to artificially peg the rupee at, say, 83 to the dollar?
No, and this is a fundamental misconception you must correct if you're studying this. The RBI's stated official philosophy, quoted directly from their mandate, is not to peg the rupee to a specific numerical target or defend a specific line in the sand.
Okay, so what is it?
Their singular goal is to maintain orderly market conditions and contain excessive volatility.
Meaning they accept the fundamental economic gravity,
Yeah.
but they control the descent.
Beautifully put. If oil is structurally more expensive, the rupee should fundamentally depreciate to reflect that reality. The RBI will let it slide. But what they will not tolerate is the rupee collapsing by 3% in a single trading session because of algorithmic panic, speculative short selling by offshore hedge funds, or just a temporary liquidity vacuum. If panic sets in, FMOD steps onto the trading floor.
Okay, wait. Let me play devil's advocate here, because this is the critique you read in the financial op-eds all the time. When FOD steps onto the floor to support the rupee against panic, what they're actually doing is selling off India's sovereign foreign exchange reserves, right?
Yes.
They are dumping the RBI's own US dollars into the market to buy up those excess rupees. Aren't we just burning through the national savings account to fight a losing battle?
It's the most common critique, but it demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how FMOD operates across a full macroeconomic cycle. FMOD's intervention is not a one-way burn rate. It is completely symmetrical. So during a period of acute pressure, like an oil shock, yes, they will aggressively sell dollars from the reserves to absorb rupee liquidity and provide a stabilizing floor. They smooth the volatility.
Right.
But the global economy is cyclical. When the pressure subsides, or when there's a massive surge of foreign direct investment or a boom in software exports, the exact opposite dynamic occurs. Suddenly, there is a massive oversupply of dollars entering the country, which would cause the rupee to appreciate too rapidly, hurting Indian exporters.
Oh.
In those moments, FMOD is on the other side of the trade. They aggressively buy those incoming dollars, injecting rupees into the market, and they use those purchased dollars to rapidly rebuild and expand the foreign exchange reserves.
So they aren't depleting the reserves structurally. They're using them as a massive shock absorber, compressing and expanding based on the global cycle.
Precisely. But here is where the true genius and the true complexity of FMOD's operation lies. We have to talk about sterilization. This is perhaps the hardest concept to grasp in this section, but it is the key to understanding modern central banking.
Let's unpack it.
Let's go back to our scenario where FMOD is defending the rupee. They sell $1 billion into the market, and in exchange, they take in the equivalent billions of Indian rupees from the commercial banks. Think about our submarine analogy.
Okay, the ballast tanks.
When FMOD takes those rupees out of the forex market, they are literally sucking rupee liquidity out of the domestic commercial banking system.
Wow. They're draining the ballast tanks to fight a fire on the deck.
Exactly. If they aren't incredibly careful, their intervention in the forex market will accidentally cause a massive domestic credit crunch. Banks will suddenly realize they don't have enough rupee cash. The overnight interest rates will violently spike. FMOD would cure the currency volatility, but accidentally trigger a domestic recession by freezing up credit.
Oh, wow. So you can't touch the exchange rate without instantly vibrating the domestic interest rates. It is a completely closed loop. So how do they prevent the credit crunch?
Through sterilization, FMOD has to perform this synchronized ballet. The exact same afternoon that the Forex desk is selling dollars and sucking rupees out of the system, the liquidity desk down the hall has to launch a variable rate repo auction.
To put the water back in?
Yes, to inject an equivalent amount of rupee liquidity back into the banks using government bonds as collateral. They intervene to protect the currency, and they sterilize the impact by simultaneously repairing the domestic liquidity. They are fighting a macroeconomic war on two fronts simultaneously every single day.
That is staggering complexity, and it explains why FMOD can't just be a trading desk executing orders. They have to be a massive forward-looking research hub. They need to know the tidal waves are coming before they hit the shore.
Which brings us to topic C under FMOD, strategic research initiatives.
You cannot navigate a submarine if you don't map the ocean currents. In 2025-26, the report highlights 3 major areas of intense FMOD research. First, they deeply studied the drivers behind certificate of deposit, or CD, issuances. Second, they began exploring alternative indices for assessing the true fair value of the Indian rupee.
They're looking beyond the traditional metrics, moving past just the standard nominal effective exchange rate, the near, and the real effective exchange rate, the rear. They are trying to build a more accurate, holistic model of where the rupee's value actually belongs in a rapidly shifting multipolar world.
Right. And third, and I find this to be the most consequential research initiative mentioned in the entire operations section, they heavily researched the systemic impact of Indian government bonds being included in global bond indices.
This is a seismic event for the Indian macroeconomy. For decades, Indian sovereign debt GSECs were functionally invisible to the largest pools of capital on the planet because they were not included in the major global bond indices managed by institutions like JP Morgan or Bloomberg.
Let's break down why index inclusion matters so much. What is the mechanical difference between an active investor and a passive index fund?
An active investor is a portfolio manager in London who reads reports, analyzes the Indian economy, and makes a conscious, deliberate choice to buy an Indian bond because they think it's a good investment. Active capital is thoughtful, but it is slow, and it is relatively small.
Okay, and a passive fund.
A passive index fund, like a massive sovereign wealth fund or a global retirement behemoth, doesn't think, it doesn't analyze. It simply runs an algorithm that blindly tracks a benchmark index.
So if the JP Morgan Emerging Market Bond Index suddenly decrees, our index is now comprised of 10% Indian government bonds.
Then every single passive fund tracking that index is mathematically forced to immediately allocate 10% of their hundreds of billions of dollars into Indian debt. It is not a choice. It is an automatic, algorithmic avalanche of capital.
Which triggers an entirely new nightmare for FMOD.
Exactly. If $20 billion suddenly slams into the Indian market in a matter of weeks, foreign entities are demanding tens of thousands of crores of rupees to buy those bonds. The rupee will violently appreciate, instantly crushing the profit margins of every exporter in India. Furthermore, the banking system's ballast tanks will violently overflow with rupee liquidity, crashing domestic interest rates.
So FMOD's Strategic Research Division was tasked with forecasting the exact velocity, size, and timing of these index-driven flows.
Yes. So the operations desk knows exactly how large of a variable rate reverse repo operation they need to execute to catch the water, and exactly how many US dollars they need to buy to sterilize the currency appreciation.
It's like calculating the exact trajectory of a meteor so you know exactly where to place the catcher's mitt.
Precisely. They are anticipating the structural shocks of global integration.
Okay, we have covered the domestic architects in FMRD, and we have covered the domestic control room engineers in FMOD. We have seen how the rules are written and how the daily liquidity and currency battles are fought. But money, ultimately, must cross borders. Trade is global, and that is where the true labyrinthine complexity of international law and diplomacy begins.
Which brings us to the third and final pillar, the Foreign Exchange Department, the FED.
The FED operates under a very specific, incredibly powerful piece of legislation, FEMA, the Foreign Exchange Management Act of 1999. The FED's core mandate is to facilitate external trade and systematically develop the foreign exchange market. And if you read their section of the 2025-26 report, you realize they went on an absolute deregulation and simplification spree.
The overarching theme for the FED this past year was an aggressive pivot away from archaic rule-by-rule micromanagement. They took dozens of disparate, outdated circulars rules that had been patched together over decades and consolidated them into streamlined, highly logical, principle-based master directions.
Let's look at a practical example of that. In October 2025, they drafted revised regulations for establishing branch offices, liaison offices, or project offices, what they call BOLOPs.
Right.
In the past, if a foreign corporation wanted to set up a simple liaison office in Bangalore, they often had to seek direct, bespoke approval from the Reserve Bank of India itself. The FED's revision was to fundamentally delegate that power. They empowered the authorized dealer banks, the commercial banks themselves, to handle these approvals based on broad RBI principles.
They're removing themselves as the bureaucratic bottleneck so foreign direct investment can land faster. But for exam purposes, there are three massive, highly technical regulatory overhauls you must commit to memory here.
Okay, the first major overhaul is FEMA 3R, the Foreign Exchange Management Borrowing and Lending Regulations 2018. The exam-critical date here is February 16, 2026. On this date, the Fed amended FEMA 3R to comprehensively consolidate all provisions related to Indian rupee borrowing. Specifically, they streamlined the framework for borrowing by persons resident in India PRIs from persons resident outside India PRIs.
It is absolutely vital to focus on the currency involved here. A PRI is an Indian resident or corporation. A PROI is a foreign entity. The RBI is actively simplifying the legal framework for an Indian company to borrow rupees directly from a foreign lender.
They aren't focused on simplifying dollar borrowing here.
No, they are actively encouraging creation of offshore rupee credit pools. This ties inextricably into the broader internationalization theme. They want foreign lenders to hold rupees and lend rupees, creating a global credit cycle independent of the dollar.
Fascinating. Okay, the second major overhaul, the Authorized Persons Framework. The date to highlight is May 6, 2026. This regulation specifically targets full-fledged money changers, or FFMCs.
These are the physical money-changing kiosks, the booths you see at international airports or in heavy tourist districts in Goa or Kerala where you physically hand over euros and get physical rupee notes.
Right, and the FED is essentially declaring that this is a sunset industry. As of May 6, 2026, the RBI formally discontinued the issuance of any fresh authorizations for FFMCs. No new players are allowed into the physical money-changing game.
However, they aren't abruptly shutting the industry down. Existing FFMCs are granted a perpetual authorization, meaning they don't have to keep reapplying for their licenses. But there is a catch.
Always a catch.
To maintain that perpetual license, they must meet a strict minimum annual Forex turnover requirement.
The logic here is ruthless, but entirely necessary. The RBI is acknowledging that the future of foreign exchange is entirely digital. They are saying, we have more than enough physical kiosks to handle the dwindling demand for paper currency exchange. We aren't going to crush the existing businesses, but we are raising the operational floor. If you aren't doing serious volume, you will lose your license, and we are closing the door behind you.
It forces consolidation in a legacy industry, while the RBI focuses its regulatory energy on digital cross-border payments.
Which leads us to the third, and perhaps the most structurally significant overhaul in this section, the new ECB framework. ECB stands for External Commercial Borrowings. This was also fully amended in February 2026. And ECB is the mechanism through which an Indian corporation borrows massive amounts of capital from a foreign institutional lender. If you contrast the old rules with the new February 2026 framework, the philosophical shift is staggering. It's like going from a centrally planned economy to a free market.
It represents the ultimate realization of principle-based regulation. Walk through the specific liberalizations.
Under the new ECB framework, the RBI drastically expanded the eligible borrower base. They expanded the recognized lender base, allowing more diverse global funds to lend into India. But here's the most fascinating mechanical change. They eliminated rigid sector-specific borrowing caps and instead linked the borrowing limits directly to the individual borrower's actual financial strength.
This is the death of the blunt instrument. In the old regime, the RBI might decree the domestic textile sector is over-leveraged. Therefore, no textile company can borrow more than $50 million externally.
Right.
It didn't matter if you were a highly profitable, brilliantly managed textile exporter with a pristine balance sheet. You were punished by the sector cap. It was completely arbitrary.
The new framework looks at the micro-level reality. The Fed is now saying, we don't care what sector you are in. Show us your EBITDA. Show us your cash flow. If you are a fundamentally strong company with a massive capacity to service debt, you are trusted to go out into the global markets and borrow heavily.
Furthermore, they deeply liberalized the end-use restrictions, giving companies more freedom on how they deploy the borrowed capital, and crucially, they removed the regulatory cap on the cost of borrowing.
Meaning the RBI is no longer dictating the maximum interest rate an Indian company can agree to pay a foreign lender.
Exactly. The interest rate is purely market-determined. They are treating Indian corporate treasurers as adults. Go to London, go to Tokyo, negotiate the absolute best debt terms you can secure based on your own creditworthiness, and simply report the transaction accurately to us.
The macroeconomic impact of this is profound. By stripping away these arbitrary bureaucratic frictions, the FAD drastically lowers the cost of capital for Tier 1 Indian corporations, instantly making them more competitive on the global stage. They can fund massive expansions at global interest rates without waiting 6 months for a bespoke RBI approval.
Huge game changer.
Okay, we have finally arrived at the absolute crown jewel of this entire annual report, the magnum opus of the Foreign Exchange Department. If you were sitting for an exam, box V.1 in Chapter V is your holy grail. We are talking about the aggressive, systematic push for the internationalization of the Indian rupee.
The big one.
We open the show with the example of the UAE gold importer bypassing the US dollar. Box V.1 details exactly how the RBI is turning that from an anomaly into the global standard.
But before we dissect the mechanics, we have to deeply understand the strategic why. Why undergo this incredibly complex, multi-decade effort to make the rupee an international currency? For almost a century, global trade has operated efficiently on the hegemony of the US dollar.
Right.
If India buys crude from Saudi Arabia, they pay in dollars. If an Indian IT firm sells software to Germany, the contract is often priced in dollars. Why aggressively rock the geopolitical boat?
There are 3 critical, existential, macroeconomic reasons outlined in the rationale for this push. First, it is about insulating Indian domestic traders from devastating exchange rate risk.
Let's run a scenario.
Let's say an Indian manufacturing firm signs a contract to export auto parts to South America, priced in US dollars with payment due in 6 months. Over those 6 months, U.S. inflation spikes, the Federal Reserve aggressively hikes interest rates, and the dollar violently appreciates against the rupee.
Right.
The Indian exporters' profit margins are completely chaotic, not because their auto parts changed in quality, but because of monetary policy decisions made in Washington, D.C.
But if that exporter can invoice their South American client directly in Indian rupees, that entire layer of currency risk simply vanishes. Their revenue is predictable and stable.
Exactly. The second reason ties directly back to our discussion about the control room, FMOD. The internationalization of the rupee drastically reduces the need for the Reserve Bank of India to hoard massive, highly costly US dollar reserves.
Yes, remember the sterilization ballet. Intervening to protect the rupee against oil shocks requires a massive war chest of hundreds of billions of US dollars.
Right.
Holding those dollars is expensive. They often yield very low returns compared to domestic investments. If India can convince its major trading partners like oil exporters to accept payment in rupees, the structural drain on those dollar reserves is vastly mitigated. India gains profound strategic and monetary autonomy. They decouple their domestic economic stability from the whims of the U.S. Federal Reserve.
And the third reason is the most basic: transaction costs. Every single time you convert rupees to dollars and then dollars to another local currency, a chain of global correspondent banks takes a percentage cut. Bypassing the dollar eliminates those middleman fees, instantly improving the margins for both the importer and the exporter.
So that's the why: geopolitical autonomy, risk mitigation, and cost efficiency.
Now, for the exam, you must understand the how. What is the actual physical architecture the FD has built to make this happen?
There are three main structural pillars detailed in Box V.1 that you need to grasp mechanically.
Pillar number 1. We return to the SRVAs, Special Rupee Vostro accounts. The report confirms that SRVAs are now fully active in 35 partner countries.
35? That's a huge footprint.
It is. This means a commercial bank in London or Tokyo or Moscow has opened a dedicated rupee account with an authorized dealer bank in Mumbai. This allows the foreign bank's corporate clients to hold rupee balances and settle bilateral trades directly through the Indian banking system without ever touching the SWIFT network's dollar channels.
And pillar number 2 takes this a step further at the sovereign level. LCAs, local currency arrangements.
The RBI has formally signed bilateral LCAs with 4 specific jurisdictions. For your exam, memorize these 4: the United Arab Emirates, Indonesia, the Maldives, and Mauritius. Again, UAE, Indonesia, Maldives, Mauritius. These are sovereign-level agreements where the central banks of both countries agree to establish direct settlement mechanisms between their domestic currencies.
And pillar number 3 is focused on the individual and corporate level. The FED has authorized that PRI's persons resident outside India can now easily open and operate regular INR accounts outside of India for bona fide trade transactions. They are pushing rupee liquidity into offshore banking centers.
Let's make this abstract architecture violently real. Let's return to our opening hook, the UAE LCA, because this is where the theory becomes practice. Under the old system, as we discussed, buying gold from Dubai meant buying dollars, paying SWIFT fees, paying conversion spreads, and praying the exchange rate didn't blow up your margin.
Right.
How does the exact same transaction happen today under the local currency arrangement?
Under the bilateral LCA framework, the Dubai gold wholesaler is legally empowered to issue their invoice directly in Indian rupees or in UAE dirhams. Let's assume they invoice in rupees.
Okay.
The Indian jeweler in Mumbai simply instructs their domestic bank to transfer rupees. That's it. The Mumbai bank electronically transfers the rupee amount directly into the Dubai wholesaler's special rupee Vostro account, their SRVA, which physically resides within the Indian banking system.
So the payment settles instantaneously.
Instantaneously. There are $0 conversion spreads paid. There are no New York correspondent banking fees. There is absolutely zero exchange rate risk for the Indian buyer. The US dollar, the Federal Reserve, and the SWIFT network are completely bypassed.
And what does the Dubai wholesaler do with a massive pile of Indian rupees sitting in their SRVA?
Well, remember what the architects at FMRD did in segment 1. The FMRD made it legal for the Dubai wholesaler to immediately invest that rupee balance into highly liquid, yield-bearing Indian treasury bills. Or, better yet, if that Dubai wholesaler decides they want to import textiles or agricultural machinery from an Indian manufacturer, they simply use the rupees sitting in their SRVA to pay the Indian exporter directly.
It creates a perfectly closed, highly efficient, frictionless ecosystem of bilateral trade. And the data from Box V.1 proves conclusively that this isn't just an academic theory. The market is adopting it aggressively. Between August 2022 and July 2025, total imports invoiced in INR saw a compound annual growth rate, a CAGR, of 20.9%. Exports invoiced in INR grew at a TAGR of 12.7%.
In the context of global currency shifts, those are staggering growth rates. It demonstrates a fundamental truth of markets. When a central bank successfully removes the friction and lowers the risk, massive corporate enterprises will naturally and ruthlessly gravitate toward the more efficient settlement method.
The internationalization of the rupee is arguably the most significant geopolitical legacy of this RBI administration. Okay, we are in the home stretch of the FED segment. Even as they rewrite global macro trade, the FED is also cleaning up the administrative, digital, and physical aspects of foreign exchange.
Yes, the micro reforms.
First up, full digitization. The FED is mandating the shift of all foreign investment data tracking to a unified platform called FIRMS, FIRMS, the Foreign Investment Reporting and Management System. The explicit goal here is to move the entire ecosystem to electronic acknowledgments. They want to completely eradicate paper trails, physical stamps, and manual processing for foreign direct investment reporting.
It is about creating radical transparency and instantaneous compliance verification.
Now, here is a very specific quirky regulation that examiners absolutely love to use as a trap question because the thresholds are so precise. We have to talk about the physical currency rules for cross-border travel with Nepal and Bhutan. This was revised in December 2025. Listen very closely to the logic of these thresholds.
The logic here is a fascinating study in balancing microeconomic facilitation with macroeconomic security.
If you are an individual traveling across the border to or from Nepal or Bhutan, you are legally permitted to take out or bring in physical Indian rupee notes in denominations up to Rs 100 with absolutely no limit. Zero cap.
Right.
You want to rent a truck and drive across the border with millions of rupees entirely in 100 rupee notes. Perfectly legal. However, for physical notes above Rs 100, which primarily means the 500 rupee notes, the total limit you can carry across the border is strictly capped at Rs 25,000 per person. Let me ask you, why such a bifurcated specific rule? Why target the 500 rupee note while letting the 100 rupee note flow freely?
It's a defense mechanism. The RBI has to thread a very difficult needle with Nepal and Bhutan because the economies are so deeply integrated, and the rupee is widely accepted across those borders. On one hand, they want to facilitate the massive volume of daily, legitimate, small-scale border trade.
Small vendors buying agricultural produce, tourists buying handicrafts.
Right, they use smaller denominations, hence no limit on the 100 rupee notes.
It lubricates the microeconomy.
Exactly. But on the other hand, the RBI is terrified of the unauthorized use of the rupee as a massive parallel, untraceable currency, as well as the risks of state-sponsored counterfeiting, money laundering, and capital flight.
Oh, I see.
If a bad actor wants to smuggle $1 million of illicit wealth across the border to launder it, they aren't going to use a truck full of 100 rupee notes. It's physically too heavy and conspicuous. They are going to use dense stacks of high-denomination 500 rupee notes. By strictly capping the movement of high denominations at Rs 25,000, the FAD severely cripples the logistics of capital flight and large-scale smuggling without disrupting the legitimate daily trade of the common citizen.
It is a brilliantly pragmatic piece of regulation. And the final piece of the FAD puzzle continues this theme of facilitating the little guy. The Export-Import Regulations 2026, published in January 2026, but slated to become fully effective on October 1st, 2026.
And this brings our entire discussion full circle back to the core philosophical shift of the RBI.
These regulations are designed specifically to help small exporters and importers by formally moving the entire compliance structure to that principle-based system we keep highlighting, entirely abandoning the old, rule-heavy prescriptive system.
The FAD is finally recognizing a stark reality. A small-scale artisan in Jaipur exporting a few crates of hand-carved furniture to Europe simply does not have a compliance department. They should not be burdened with the exact same labyrinthine paperwork, the same rigid reporting timelines, and the same punitive minor infraction framework as a multi-billion-dollar steel conglomerate exporting megatonnage to China.
Exactly.
By moving to principle-based regulations, the AD banks can use discretion. They can facilitate the small artisans' trade quickly, ensuring the broad principles of foreign exchange law are met without drowning the entrepreneur in red tape. It structurally lowers the barrier to entry for the Indian middle class to participate in global trade.
Okay, let's take a massive step back. We have been in the weeds of regulatory minutia, repo mechanics, and cross-border thresholds for nearly an hour. Let's synthesize exactly what we have witnessed in Chapter 5. Let's look at the grand architecture.
We started with the architects, the FMRD. They are fundamentally upgrading the structural integrity of the domestic markets. They eliminated the archaic concentration limits for FPIs to vastly deepen the corporate bond market. They granted SRO status to FinMkt to allow peer-based, rapid regulatory adaptation.
Right, and they constructed the UMI platform to enable the atomic risk-free settlement of tokenized certificates of deposit using purely digital wholesale CBDC. And they replaced a broken, uncollateralized altimeter with the mathematically unshakable SAR benchmark.
They built a high-speed, frictionless, mathematically secure domestic engine.
Then we moved to the control room, the FMOD. The engineers steering the submarine through increasingly violent geopolitical waters. We saw them implement the revised September 2025 Liquidity Management Framework, mastering the complex hydraulics of variable rate repos to perfectly balance the massive drains of government tax collections and the floods of global capital.
And we watched them execute the incredibly delicate two-way sterilization ballet in the forex markets, smoothing out the violent shocks of global oil prices without triggering a domestic credit freeze. And we saw their research division mathematically anticipating the impending avalanche of passive capital driven by global bond index inclusions.
They prove they can maintain total domestic stability regardless of external global chaos. And finally, we cross borders with the diplomats, the FED. They are actively constructing the global highways for India's economic future. They consolidated complex borrowing rules under FEMA 3R. They radically simplified the external commercial borrowing framework, pivoting from arbitrary sector caps to true financial strength-based lending, lowering the global cost of capital for Indian champions.
And above all else, they're aggressively executing the internationalization of the rupee. Through special rupee Vostra accounts in 35 countries and local currency arrangements, bypassing the dollar entirely, they are rewriting the rules of global settlement.
It is a masterclass in comprehensive, multi-pronged macroeconomic strategy. They are simultaneously elevating domestic efficiency to the absolute bleeding edge of global standards while ruthlessly protecting the sovereignty of the rupee from external shocks. And that brings us to the final thought, the synthesis that we want you to really chew on, not just so you can pass your exam, but so you can understand the future of the industry you are about to enter. We spent this deep dive strictly categorizing the RBI's moves into three pillars, the FMRD, the FMOD, the FED.
But the true genius of the 2025-26 annual report is realizing what happens when those pillars inevitably converge.
This is where the horizon actually lies. Think about the massive dots we just connected. Under the architects in FMRD, we have the RBI successfully piloting the tokenization of assets, settling instantaneously on a distributed ledger, using wholesale central bank digital currency via the UMI platform, complete, frictionless, domestic digital settlement.
Meanwhile, under the diplomats in the FED, we have the aggressive expansion of special rupee Vostra accounts, legally allowing foreign corporations to hold rupees and invest them in Indian debt.
If you overlap the DLT infrastructure of the FMRD with the international legal frameworks of the FED,
You arrive at a very clear, very imminent singularity. Are we looking at a future perhaps only 24 or 36 months from now, where our Dubai gold wholesaler sitting in their office in the UAE uses the rupee balance in their local SRVA to seamlessly, instantly purchase a tokenized Indian corporate bond directly on the UMI platform?
and that cross-border multi-million-dollar transaction settles atomically in milliseconds via wholesale CBDC. No New York correspondent banks. No T+2 settlement delays, no US dollar conversion spreads, no settlement risk, just pure, frictionless atomic cross-border digital finance, denominated entirely in the Indian rupee.
The walls between domestic technological innovation and cross-border geopolitical strategy are completely collapsing. The atomic settlement plumbing being built by the FMRD is the exact technological machinery that will execute the global internationalization dreams of the FED. They are two halves of the exact same engine.
It isn't just a regulatory update document. It is the literal blueprint for a multipolar financial architecture. And understanding that blueprint, understanding the mechanical how and the geopolitical why the Reserve Bank of India is building it this way, is how you truly master this material.
Don't rely on rote memorization. Understand the physics of the system. Understand why a VRR auction balances an oil shock, or why tokenization eliminates settlement risk. If you understand the underlying logic of the control room, the dates and the acronyms will naturally fall into place.
Exactly. If you can explain the sterilization ballet or the mechanics of an SRVA bypassing the SWIFT network to appear, you are entirely bulletproof for this exam. To the dedicated student out there listening to this, probably on your third cup of coffee, you have got this. Step back from the sheer volume of the syllabus. See the grand logical progression of the fortress becoming the control room. We wish you the absolute best of luck. Take a deep breath, trust your grasp of the mechanics, and go crush it.